And we really have no technologies, no commercialized technologies at the moment which can do those jobs on anything like the same way that, the existing technologies. So to commit ourselves to this target was to create this hostage to fortune, which just sort of assumed that if we set the target, then these required technologies, will just magic themselves into existence.
Hello, everyone. I'm a glass half full man, usually, an optimist by nature, but I'm fascinated by trends and fashions that move public opinion. And I've just used the general phrase moves public opinion, which cries out for definition. That's to say, to the extent that what was once a fringe or minority view becomes mainstream. Such is the case with the climate change debate and government strategies regarding moves towards achieving net zero. From what I've read, in countries like Switzerland and the UK, there's a relatively high acceptance at the conceptual level. But when legislation, regulation and costs are considered by the general population, Mr. and Mrs. John Public begin to have reservations and second thoughts. This seems to be increasingly the case. I took even greater notice of this when I came across a book written by a journalist friend of mine who's based in the UK. A few years ago, he published a book called Not Zero: How an Irrational Target Will Impoverish You, Help China, and Not Even Save the Planet. I bought the book and called him to ask him if he would be on my show to explain his point of view and interpretation of the evidence. Ross Clark is a well-known journalist who writes for The Times, Daily Mail, The Spectator, and other journals. He's an author and independent thinker, and look out for him on the online platform Substack Ross on Why. He joins me from England via Zoom today. Hello, Ross. It's good to see you again after so many years. Thanks for making time to be on my show.
Hello, Michael. Pleasure.
Ross, I'm not sure where our conversation will lead us today, but I'm very keen, and I'm sure our listeners are too, to hear your arguments about the net zero climate change emissions debate. It gets so heated, if you forgive the pun. But Ross, you end your book, Not Zero, in the following philosophical and positive way. I quote what you wrote. It is the way with human civilizations. We are programmed forever to worry, to believe that a sticky end lies just around the corner, but we are also imbibed with the ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive. I think I can guess your answer to this question, but would you describe yourself as a glass half full man or a glass half empty when it comes to the net zero climate change emissions debate?
I have absolute confidence in the ability of human civilization to survive anything the climate can throw at us. I mean, already as a species, we've survived several ice ages and the rapid warming which followed those ice ages and which occurred over very short periods of time as well, and the rapid rise in sea levels which accompanied those. The idea that humans are somehow doomed, that climate change is an existential threat, I think is really rather a bit silly, because I say, we have ultimately, vastly more resources now to cope with anything the climate throws at us than we used to have. In the sort of 10,000 years ago when sea levels were rising rapidly. So, I don't think it's obviously changing climate, it imposes costs and it imposes risks on human civilizations. In the context of Europe, I think it's, well, certainly Northern Europe where I live, it's mostly sea level rise. Other parts of the world may become more liable to drought. Other places may become liable to very high temperatures. But the idea that we cannot somehow survive that is, I think, really rather silly.
I must say, Ross, I'm sympathetic to that point of view, but I've got lots of questions for you, and we're going to examine some of these things a little bit more closely as we talk. You're based in the UK, as I said, and use that country mainly as your reference, at least in the book. Please give me and our listeners a brief, if you can, a brief overview right at the beginning of our conversation on what UK policy targets are regarding net zero and how these policies came about, because there seems to be an increased public debate about them nowadays. That's my sense, even though I'm not living in the UK anymore. Why the increase in the tempo of the public debate?
Well, I mean, to answer your first question, I mean, the situation in Britain is it was the first sort of major country to set itself this legally binding target to decarbonize the entire economy by 2050. It's a net zero target. So if we're still emitting some carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, we're supposed to counter them by through negative emissions, through carbon capture, storage, and that sort of thing. That was imposed in 2019, and
2019.
In the dying days of Theresa May's government, when she was sort of forced out of office during those interminable Brexit negotiations. And this, I think she intended it to be her legacy, but it's the way that it was sort of forced through Parliament. As you know, at the time, Parliament was consumed by the Brexit issue, which was endless and complicated and so on. But the net zero target was sort of put through in the space of an afternoon. I think they had 90 minutes debate. They didn't even have a vote in the House of Commons, the lower house of our Parliament. It was just sort of nodded through, and this is the most consequential piece of legislation in my lifetime, really, because it, essentially commits us to deconstructing the entire industrial system that we've built up over the past 200 years and which has made us fantastically wealthy by past comparisons, and replace almost every technology we've picked up along the way with something different. And I think MPs, few of whom seem to have much in the way of a scientific or technological training, I don't think they really sort of understood what was involved. They just listened to a sort of David Attenborough program and thought, we've got to do something about this.
That's what I wanted to ask you, Ross. Without going into the sort of parliamentary details, where on earth did the notion come from? I mean, the seed of the idea must have come from somewhere. Or was there a wing of the party, the Conservative Party, or the government at the time that was pushing this through?
Well, we'd already had, since 2008, we'd had a target of reducing net carbon emissions by 80% on 1990 levels by 2050. So there was already a target there. But, to go that, I mean, that was hard enough. But, I mean, to go the sort of eliminate the last 20% of emissions, I mean, there's a whole different sort of game, really. I mean, it's sort of the question of the low-hanging fruit. You can reduce your emissions quite a bit through just energy efficiency and minor changes to, burning gas instead of coal and that sort of thing. But by the time you get to the last 20%, you're having to decarbonize industries like cement, steel making, and fertilizers, which have very strong process emissions. They're not sort of emissions associated with the energy used in those industries. It's the chemical process of making steel, making cement, fertilizer, which emits the carbon dioxide. And we really have no technologies, no commercialized technologies at the moment which can do those jobs on anything like the same way that the existing technologies. So to commit ourselves to this target was to create this hostage to fortune, which just sort of assumed that if we set the target, then these required technologies will just magic themselves into existence. And of course that doesn't always happen.
You've answered my next question, Ross, but I'll put it to you anyway, because I'd written down three big words on my notes. If you think that these net zero policies and strategies are sensible, affordable, and achievable, at least in the UK. But before you answer me, Switzerland has a similar 2050 target enshrined in Swiss federal law. There are a number of other countries, I think, that are going down this path as well and having
Yeah.
similar debates within their populations. But tell me how you see it in terms of the UK being sensible, affordable, and achievable.
Well, it's not affordable, sensible, achievable at all. I mean, it's, as I said, it relies on the invention of technologies which we don't currently have. Now, I mean, if you're going to commit yourself to any target, particularly if you're going to commit yourself to a legally binding target,
Yeah,
then you ought to have a pretty well, whatever it is, you ought to have a pretty good idea of how you're going to achieve it. And or sometimes it's been likened to the promise that John F. Kennedy made in 1961 to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, which we know was achieved. But it's a somewhat difference there, wasn't there? I mean, there was one narrowly defined target, which Kennedy set himself, and he set a budget, and nothing horrible was going to happen if America didn't get to the moon by the 31st of December 1969. It would have simply been rolled over into the next decade, or they put
exactly.
no, and nobody tends to quote the promise that NASA made in 1968 to put a man on Mars by 1980, and that one was a completely different matter, of
Did
course.
NASA really promise that? I didn't
There
know.
were
I'd forgotten that.
yeah, yeah. So, we've created this huge hostage to fortune, and
So,
it's very unlikely. And the consequences of it are never thought through. Now, it's one thing having a target, having a legally binding target, which is written into law, and if it doesn't get achieved, then activists can actually sue the government. Well, that's a whole different matter. And
yeah,
you saw in Switzerland a very good example of that when there's of elderly people decided to sue the government
that's right.
because they couldn't go outside during a heat wave, and they
That's
said
right.
it can it can contravene their right to a family life because the Swiss government hadn't succeeded in reducing carbon emissions. Well, I mean, the Swiss government on its own cannot reduce global carbon emissions.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
I mean, it's completely, lunatic piece of legislation, and yet that was passed in a sort of human rights basis.
Yes, of course, because it's popular and it seems there's no downside, so let's have a go and let's try. But tell me, Ross, I know your book is heavily researched, so I'm just curious to know if these so-called sensible government policies, at least in the eyes of the government, if they become casualties in their first meeting with engineers, scientists, politicians, accountants, and civil servants. I mean, what in your research, what did you find out that went on when these different specialists all came together and must have come to the view that actually this isn't going to work, or doesn't it? Did
Well,
you find that out?
yeah, well, it is gradually becoming obvious. But of course, you set a target for 2050, and when it was passed as 31 years into the future, you
Yeah,
don't have to worry about it too
no,
much
that's true.
because you're gonna be out of office by then. You're gonna be retired. It's going to be somebody else's problem. But as there were a lot of interim targets set along the way, and each time we get close to these, they collide with reality and they tend to be dropped. We had a policy, for example, a target promised to abolish oil-fired boilers by
Mm.
the year 2026, the
I
year
read
when they
about that.
win.
Yeah,
Well, that had to be dropped by the government because it became obvious that it wasn't going to be able to we weren't going to be able to meet it. The same as happening with the gas boiler target. The electric car target has been relaxed more in the EU than it has been in Britain, but it has already been relaxed in Britain and will probably have to be put off further. So yeah, I mean, every time an ill thought out target we get to the date, it gets revised, it gets dropped because it becomes obvious that there was no technology, there was no thought behind that target when it was put into law.
And I can imagine the politicians and maybe even some of the civil servants have moved on, retired, or gone on to other jobs, or been voted out of office. And so, in a way, nobody takes that much notice of it.
Well, yeah, Theresa May was out of office 2 weeks later.
2 weeks
Boris
later.
Johnson, who took it on enthusiastically, he's been out of office for 3 years. I mean, none of those. By the time we get to 2050, I mean, it can be virtually guaranteed that virtually none of those MPs
None of
who
us will be here.
nodded through that piece of legislation will still be there to suffer the consequences.
My guest today is Ross Clark, the acclaimed British journalist and writer, and we're talking via Zoom between Switzerland and England about net zero. Ross, it's natural that we notice most what is close to us. Now, if we imagine a situation where continental Europe and the British Isles were to achieve net zero by 2050, let's just, I posit that. Let's just think that that might happen. What practical differences would that make to global measurements, and at what cost to European citizens? Have you ever done that kind of modelling?
Well, the UK accounts for about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's fallen throughout the past 35 years. I don't have a figure on top of my head for the whole of Europe, but it's it's not going to be more than 10%. It will have very minimal difference if European countries reach net zero by 2050. But there's another important point to make here is that the 2050 target for Britain and also for EU countries is only for what they call territorial emissions. This is greenhouse gases which are physically spewed out within Britain or spewed out within Europe. It doesn't count the emissions that are embedded in goods which are imported to Europe, nor services which are provided in Europe. If the emission is in China, it doesn't count on the European budget. So, we get to a situation where, our government in Britain is, boasting, oh, look, we've reduced carbon emissions by more than 50% on 1990 levels. And then you say, look at our manufacturing figures, you think, no, we haven't. What we've done is we've exported our manufacturing industry, our heavy industry, and we've offshored our emissions by doing that. So it becomes a very sort of meaningless exercise to reach net zero territorial emissions in Britain and Europe when we're still, importing goods, using goods, enjoying services which are causing emissions elsewhere in the world.
And I can imagine that other industrialized economies like the United States, like Germany, are in a similar situation.
Well, Germany is a very similar situation to Britain. The United States has withdrawn from its climate commitments, so
Right.
it's not in that position. As for China, they have a notional target to reach net zero emissions by 2060, but it has been made pretty clear that it is not going to be achieved at the cost to economic growth, and it is an aspiration. It's not written into a law where activists are going to sue the government. They're being pragmatic about it, if you like. And people talk about China. There are some people always say about China, well, look, it's building all these coal-fired power stations. Other people say, look at China, it's the biggest investor in renewable energy in the world. Well, both of those things are true, but China is hugely energy hungry. It wants energy security, and wants to look for energy wherever it can and diversify its supply. Now, that is the sort of sensible thing to do. And I'm nothing against renewable energy, investing in wind and solar and geothermal and other technologies here. But the trouble is, we've got a government that is intent on making those virtually the only sources of energy we have. And that is giving us very, very high energy prices and is sending our industries offshore and much of our wealth with it.
Well, let's just just look outside the UK for a while. I picked, apart from China, I picked two other countries. I wouldn't say at random, but they have, for good reason, uh, different aspects geographically and climate-wise. I mean, how do you, or tell us if you've looked into how the Dutch deal with climate change? I mean, they've had centuries of dealing with flooding, and those sorts of extremes coming in from the North Sea, and Bangladesh, which is, the, if you like, one huge river estuary and floods on a regular basis, and is not a rich country, unlike the Netherlands. Leaving China to one side, you've touched on that. Are there things that we can learn from the Dutch, for
Yeah,
example, or even from Bangladesh,
yeah, well,
struggling with climate change and sea level rise?
the Netherlands and Bangladesh are very vulnerable to sea and river flooding. They sit on deltas which have
Yeah.
shift with time and are very vulnerable to rising sea levels. But the difference, as you just mentioned there, is in the level of wealth. The
Mm.
Dutch have been defending their coastline for centuries. They've got incredibly good at it, which means they can live in a country which is quarter of it is below sea level.
That's
They
right.
can live there without fear of flooding, building high walls, pumping stations, and
And cheap
everything.
and cheap
Bangladesh
energy
is
as
that.
well.
Yeah,
Cheap energy
Bangladesh
as
is
well.
actually getting better at handling with floods, but still they're a long way behind. Um, but if you want Bangladesh to evolve into a country like the Netherlands, which doesn't have to worry about flooding so much, then you have to allow its economy to grow. And it would be very cruel, evil even to deny Bangladesh the ability to grow its economy to the level where it can defend its coastline, defend its land from river flooding in the way that the Netherlands does very successfully. And that is the absolute key to, I don't I, I accept the desirability of reducing carbon emissions, maybe one day eliminating them, but there should be a golden rule here that it is not achieved at the cost of economic growth. And at the moment, it is. We are compromising economic growth in Britain by pursuing this target. We are closing down our industries. We are subjecting our people to far higher energy prices than need be, all to reach this target. That target has become a sort of millstone around the neck of the UK economy and also around other European economies.
Mm. Share with me your views on adaptation, Ross. I mean that, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, that's what we humans have done anyway for centuries.
Yeah,
Is it really different this time?
no, it's not different this time. Let's take take one of the sort of big threats that we keep being told. Heat wave deaths. Every summer, every northern hemisphere summer, we get the same thing. Hot weather, people die as they always do during hot weather. The
Well,
mortality rate always
elderly people die.
increases
Yeah.
because people who are um, very elderly and last stage of terminal illness are very vulnerable, particularly to high temperatures. But we just get told that story. What we don't get told is that 9/10 of deaths from extreme temperatures are from extreme cold temperatures. And that's true even in African countries. Um, but and while there has been an increase in heat wave related deaths over the past 30 years in Britain and around the world, there's been a far bigger decrease in deaths from extreme cold temperatures because we've had fewer cold temperatures. Now, everyone knows that you can adapt to cold temperatures by living in a house with central heating. You can adapt to very high temperatures by living in a house with air conditioning. Um, Air conditioning is a quite a simple and straightforward adaptation to heat waves. Um, but in Britain, we have this bizarre situation where government warns of heat waves and heat wave deaths. We've got to try and change the climate to avoid them. And all the time, it's actually stifling the installation of air conditioning units in British homes. We'll hand out these big grants to heat pumps, which will work in one direction, but it refuses to allow any of this money to be spent on air-to-air heat pumps, air conditioning units, which could be reversed and could help cool our homes in
Ross,
the
I'm not.
summer.
I'm by no means an engineer, but isn't air conditioning quite? Doesn't it use energy quite intensively?
Air conditioning does use uh, energy, obviously, but I mean, no more intensely than central heating does. So I mean, it's just sort of, I mean, if you want to have an air properly air conditioned, I mean, you have to input some energy, but the nature of a heat pump has always been told when it comes to air to water heat pump or a ground source heat pump, you get more energy out than you put in, and the same is true of an air conditioning unit. Properly designed, it's pumping air from one, it's pumping heat energy out of the house essentially, and you can pump more heat energy out of the house than the unit's actually consuming. So
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think we should be frightened that air conditioning units consume energy, where they are necessary to make people comfortable in hot weather. I mean, they
And
are part of the quality of life.
and have you put this point of view to enthusiasts of emissions and the other side of the argument? I mean, what do they say to you when you say this to them?
Oh yes, I'm always writing on this issue, and no, I mean, the government continues to have a policy to suppress the development of air conditioning units in Britain because it sees it as a source of emissions. And therefore, but I mean, the thing about air conditioning, when do you need it most? In the middle of the day in summer? Well, that's when the solar panels are generating most of the energy. And at the moment, we've got a grid that's not able to absorb all the renewable energy because it's intermittent and it's only being generated at some time. Well, actually, there's a very good match between solar energy, electricity generation, and air conditioning. So why we should be trying to suppress the growth of air conditioning? I don't understand.
And how do they do that? By pricing, by taxing? I mean, what mechanism does government use to discourage the development of air conditioning use?
Well, how it works in Britain is the government is making huge subsidies available for the installation of heat pumps,
Right.
but only heat pumps which only send energy in one direction. It
Yeah.
will not allow that money to be used for reversible heat pumps. So of
I
course they
see.
get squeezed out the market, and they just it's very, very difficult to have them installed because the all the plumbers and electricians who might be installing them, they're all working on the very subsidized heat pumps,
I
which
see.
are
I see. Let me ask you a hypothetical question, Ross. I mean, imagine at some point in the next 10 to 15 years, these policies are seen to be unachievable and begin to unravel, at least let's say in the UK, where you're closest to the UK. Give your educated guess as to what you think will happen politically and socially, because the public might well feel badly cheated, badly done by.
well, the public will do. I mean, we have these opinion polls or ask people what should we do anything about climate change? Of course, you get a big majority in favour. It's always about 70% of people in Britain say they support the net zero target. But when you ask them specific questions, would you be able to prepare to give up your car, your gas boiler, your foreign holidays in order to achieve net zero? You get a completely different answer.
Yeah.
Because, when the question is put a sort of generalized basis, people don't understand the trade-offs, the costs, and so on. They're all for it, but when you spell it out that this is actually going to be hugely expensive, it's going to impact on your quality of life, then people start to drop support. And we've seen this over the years, and it is going to happen sooner or later. Before we get to 2050, that 2050 target will have to go. Will it go in 2030, 2040, or in 2049? I don't know, but I think, it is absolutely going to have to go before we get to the big day. It'll take a bit of political upheaval, but, we'll reach a stage where the majority of people are no longer openly supporting net zero, and then it will become much easier for a government to drop it. And we've already, since I wrote the book 3 years ago, we've already now got two of parties who are in contention for the next general election who are in favour of dropping that target already. So the political ground has already begun to shift.
For those who don't follow British politics very closely, which parties are those?
The Conservatives and Reform UK.
Yeah. Last question, Ross. What's your best description of a scenario or scenarios that governments need to adopt to come to terms, the best terms possible for their populations in these times of technological advance, political uncertainty, and we see what's happening in the Gulf right now as we speak, and though unevenly distributed, global economic growth, because little by little the world is getting richer, although there are still great disparities between those with great wealth and those who are poor. But you must have thought about this a lot as the various scenarios, or is it just going to gradually die by the wayside and the technology will come and we'll adapt to it and we'll forget what happened 10 years before? How do you see the future then?
Well, I see that most of the world will continue to prioritise economic growth and will not follow Britain and Europe down the path of setting themselves these impractical targets. And that's what's going to happen. And, the scenario I see is that Europe will eventually come around to that way of thinking and will start to prioritise economic growth. But by that time, we will have lost a lot of our industry and we will be relatively poorer in the world. But there's certainly no chance on earth I can see that developing countries will, sacrifice economic growth to achieve net zero targets. It's just not going to happen.
Ross, many thanks for making time for me today. I found the conversation enlightening and very useful, and it's helped me look at some of these arguments from a slightly different perspective that I hadn't really thought of before. My guest today has been Ross Clarke, the acclaimed British journalist and writer who's joined me from England via Zoom. Thanks again, Ross.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for listening to the McKay Interview podcast. You can find my show on most of the leading podcast platforms, plus the complete playlist dating back to 2012 can be found by writing The McKay Interview into your browser. Thanks again for listening.